One of the projects that's always been on the top of my design bucket list is to design a brand for a museum. I am a museum girly. I love them. They are my happy place. And I'm really lucky that I get to live in Washington, D.C. that has about 50 museums that are completely free to visit. That actually leads me to today's project, because in 2020, Congress commissioned a new Smithsonian museum here in D.C., the American Women's History Museum. That is personally a really meaningful thing to me, and just thinking about it gets me a little bit giddy. Now, of course, to get a museum actually open is like a decade-long process. The Museum of African American History took 13 years after it was commissioned by Congress to actually open. And obviously, the current landscape here in Washington is a little bit wild right now, so who knows if and when it will ever actually come to be. But it got me thinking about what I would do if they actually called me up and asked me to brand the thing. So that is today's project. Step one for any brand is always strategy. But first, I have to give a little confession. I actually almost scrapped this entire project before I even started. And I was going to cut all this part out, but I realized that this is something that kind of happens a lot as a designer. And so I figured I'm going to just talk about it because maybe you found yourself in the same boat and it might be nice to know that you're not alone. So just as I started researching this, I discovered that there's actually another women's history museum also trying to come to life here in DC at the same time. That one is called the National Women's History Museum, and it is a completely separate organization than the one backed by the Smithsonian. This one is being led by a nonprofit that was founded way back in 1996, and they currently have an online digital museum, and they're trying to get a building here in DC and do the same thing. Now, on its own, that wouldn't faze me that much. Competitors exist, and multiple things happen in the same space. That's fine. But when I looked into it, I discovered that not only does this already have a brand, they have a really good one. And it was designed by Paula Scheer at Pentagram. For the non-design nerds in the room, Pentagram is probably the most famous branding agency in the world, and Paula Scheer is an icon, specifically known for making really incredible brands for organizations and public works in the arts. And unsurprisingly, the brand is great, and pretty much exactly what I would try for if I was just going to close my eyes and conjure up a brand for this museum. Okay, so now what? I almost just pulled out and chose something else, but I decided to push through because sometimes this happens. Sometimes you're noodling around in the early stages looking for inspiration, and you find one specific project that's kind of exactly what you wanted to make if you could wave a magic design wand, and it can feel completely deflating. And how do you push past that, right? I actually did a whole video about this a few months ago where I talk about the 4 questions that I've kind of figured out over the years to help me push through to find my own style when I'm feeling impostery and stuck and I'm feeling like I'm aping other people. Sometimes you can see something and it feels like they've sucked all of the creativity up in the world and there's nothing left for you. My favorite 1-2 punch of questions to ask myself in those moments are, what specifically do I love about this? And what would I actually do differently? When you start to identify the exact things that you like about something, it helps you realize that it's not just that it's perfect and you suck and that's the end. It's that you're recognizing pieces of your own taste in that thing. And the clearer you can be about what those elements are and what you would do differently helps you realize that you're not just copying a thing, you're able to take it and turn it into something new. So with that, I went about really thinking about this museum, who they were, what their needs were going to be, who their audience is going to be targeting, so that I could come up with a brand that was really specific and set them apart from a very similar organization with a very similar name. Sometimes that's going to be really relevant because you need to be able to trademark something to set yourself apart from a competitor that looks really similar. So I decided to build out this brief as though I just sat down for a strategy meeting with the team and we had agreed on a really clear visual direction to lead us forward. So here's the brief. The American Women's History Museum is sponsored by the Smithsonian Institute. So it doesn't need to say Smithsonian or be branded as Smithsonian, but it does need to fit in with the other institutions. The primary objective of this museum is really to tell untold stories and share the contributions of women to our collective American history, and to inspire people to see the potential in themselves. The primary lifeblood of museums in DC are the endless flood of school groups here on class trips, as anyone who has seen Spider-Man would know. Honestly, a lot of these stories can feel a little bit heavy, and it's incredibly important that the tone of this is celebratory and honoring of these women and really inspiring. History museums can also feel a little bit dry, and this museum really wants to appeal to students. It needs to feel vibrant and fun and interactive and really engaging. They want to tell these stories in a way that captures the imagination of young people and helps them connect to different periods in American history. And honestly, the first place my brain went was my obsession with American Girl dolls as a kid. I really loved them, and it might be a little bit embarrassing to admit to what degree my understanding and sort of contextualization of things like the American Revolution or Pearl Harbor or the Great Depression came from reading a lot of those books that kind of put an image in my brain and helped me connect to a period in history in a way that a textbook couldn't. And that's really what this museum wants to do. So I really want to channel some of that energy and try to highlight specific women as heroes in these stories. So with that, the brand needs to feel lively and vibrant and fun. They need to stand out from their very direct competitor in a way that won't confuse people. And it needs to have a flexible enough visual language that it can be applied to a lot of different kinds of signage and exhibit design and environmental design and storytelling as new content continues to roll out. They want a framework to be able to highlight women as heroes and to be able to keep coming up with new content indefinitely. So that's the brief. As with the rest of the series, I'm going to leave that in the description of this video. So if you want to pause now and take that brief and see what you would come up with, I would love to see what you would make. Or finish mine and then try your hand later and see what you would do with this brand. I'd love to see it. Okay, strategy over. On to my favorite part, visual inspiration. So I kind of did 3 different sets of inspiration gathering for this project. The first thing I did was pull up the logos of all of the other Smithsonian institutes so that I could look at them all together and see if there were any through lines or information that needed to be included, how much they referenced each other, if they needed to kind of look like a matched set. And what I discovered is they are all kind of their own thing. They all exist on the Smithsonian website, but they also have their own websites. And they have completely different brands that don't really talk to each other. So that's a relief, but I still want to be able to look at them all periodically and make sure that whatever I make feels like it would sort of fit in that family in some way. The second thing I did was look really closely at the other brand and make sort of an anti-inspiration list. Not just from like a pride perspective, it's really important when you have a brand that close that you make sure that you have enough elements that you're not going to get confusion, or you could actually put the brand in some legal trouble. Ultimately, there's probably going to be some connection no matter what. They use a lot of black. I'm going to use a lot of black. I'm fine with that. But I want to make sure that I can be intentional about my choices so that at least it's clear when you look at them side by side that they're 2 different things. So first off is logo. Paula made a very cool stylized W that morphs in different spaces and is what I would call a logo as frame design. So you have a containing shape and then you put different images and video and things within it as the primary visual of the brand. I really love this style of brand, and it's actually something that Paula Scher is kind of known for. And I think it's a really smart choice for something like a museum because you can have a lot of different iterations to show different exhibits and stuff. But for our purposes, that means that a W logo is out, and so is the logo as frame concept, because I think it would get too similar. So I need to find another way to do that kind of repetitive visual storytelling that I want to do. So the second obvious thing to look at is color. I am going to use a lot of black and white because I think it makes sense for a museum. It's a strong palette. It's cheap to print, and I think it makes a lot of sense in this context, so I'm not too worried about that, but I can at least stay away from their primary color palette. They use a strong cobalt as their primary, so that or anything kind of similar is out for me. The brand is also pretty limited on color, so I'm actually thinking that leaning into something pretty colorful could be a way to differentiate myself as I move forward. The last thing to look at is typography. They're using a very condensed sans serif that looks sort of Babus New adjacent to me, so I can stand out by using a very different weight and shape of font. Probably still going to lean towards a sans serif, but I'm going to pick something that feels very different from that, so that if you put just the 2 word marks next to each other, there's no confusion. Okay, now with that recon done, I can get to the fun part, which is just browsing the internet for inspiration and starting to see what wheels are turning for me. So as I'm starting to browse around, my eye keeps going to systems that have a lot of different color variations and are using like flat graphic elements over photography to create their own sort of visual system. I know from the jump that I want to use a lot of really strong photography, and I'm going to take everything into black and white because I'm going to be pulling images from a lot of different time periods that are going to have varying levels of quality. So I'm probably going to do like a halftone texture just to like ease that out a little bit. So I'm looking specifically for brands that mix in a lot of black and white photography with a lot of strong color elements. And I'm starting to see some really clear patterns emerge over the things that I'm liking. That's what I love about the inspiration process. It doesn't take long before you start realizing that the things that you're pulling are all speaking to each other, and that it's not just one image that you're getting interested in. You're picking out elements that are repeating themselves. And you're kind of falling in love more with the individual element than any one inspiration point. The mood board itself starts to take shape as its own entity rather than just like getting locked into one thing, which is really magical. Okay, I did about an hour of browsing, which is about my cutoff before I have to tell myself to stop and move on with something else. Otherwise, I could literally do this all day. There are a million ways to do a mood board, but I like to take a very more is more approach. A lot of people like a very minimal pared down board with 9 or 12 images on a grid that you can really dial in. For me, I think it's really useful at a lot of different points in the process to have a lot of images to come back to. Beyond what I show a client, I like to have a lot of things that I'm personally referencing. So my process is I pin like mad anything that I'm even remotely inspired by. Then I pull out most of those images and I put them onto a folder that is within my project folder. So that way, if I ever come back to this project later, I don't have a bunch of unlinked images when I try to open this up again. It's all contained in the same folder. And then I take all those images, dump them onto an Illustrator board, and start sorting them in piles by type. As I start going through the images that I pulled, I start seeing patterns and things that kind of connect each other. And it becomes really clear if I have like one group of inspiration that could be for mood board 1 and another that might be for mood board 2, for example. In this case, I'm not going to worry so much about that because I'm not presenting 3 different mood boards. But if I was doing this for a client, it would start to be really clear what my separate ideas are. I spend more time here than maybe I need to, but I love to have a big pile of images that I can kind of sift out into different trains of thought. And then I pick from there and select down what goes on my actual mood board. I keep everything on my messy workspace so that then over time, I can keep going back to those images. So if I ever feel stuck later on in the process, I'm not just committed to what I put on the mood board that I show the client. I also have all of the other things I was inspired by that I might find like a little graphic element or a different way that they're laying out type or something that inspires me later if I get a little bit stuck somewhere. I know that not everyone has my messy brain, but it really works for me. So from there, I can really pick the cream of the crop and I can put them together into a cohesive mood board that really speaks to each other and starts referencing individual elements that I'm going to reference in the brand. So here's my final mood board. It's extremely colorful, and these pieces use a lot of black and white photography overlaid with color in ways that are kind of interesting. These images give me some directions that I want to play with later. I'm not sure what's going to end up in the final design, but it gives me some places to start as I'm laying out posters and graphics. But no matter what, there are a few things that are becoming really clear in this mood board. Making the hero really strong black and white photography, having nice, clean, bold, minimal type as a supporting element to that, and a pretty expansive color palette that I can pull from as needed for exhibits moving forward. So inspiration achieved, it's time to move on to phase 3, which is identity branding. One of my favorite hacks is that I've made a project template folder for myself that I duplicate every time I have a new client project with all of the folders and subfolders within it ready to go for everything I'm going to put in and hand over to a client later. And within that folder, I have an Illustrator template that I've made for myself for branding projects so that it's already kind of laid out in sections for me and I don't have to start with a blank piece of paper every time. One of the things in this file is a test page for typography. So I've pulled out some of my favorite sort of standard starting point typefaces. And then I can swap in the name of the brand, and I have a whole bunch of typefaces that I can really quickly decide, no, I definitely don't want anything in that family. Actually, this is kind of an interesting layout. And I can start seeing how the word lays out in a lot of different styles really quickly. And today I'm not actually going to go much further than that because one of the typefaces I have laid out is Gill Sans. And I really love the way this lays out in their extra bold. Gill Sans is what I would call a humanist sans serif. It's got a lot of curves. It's got a lot of personality. It's very bold and chunky. And if you'll notice, it's very different in vibe than that condensed sans serif that the other brand was using. I really love how like graphic and bold this is. And in some ways, it feels a little bit feminine to me, not in like a fussy way, but it's got a lot of good curves. I love that perfect O. And I think it could be a really good starting point for a really strong graphic brand. So I'm going to run with it. As always, though, as I'm laying this out, I'm really staring at the letter forms and seeing are there any small tweaks that I can do to make this specific set of words really fit in nicely together. I'm going to really massage the kerning, and I'm going to see are there any specific tweaks that I want to make to the letter forms themselves for the specific lockup. I think here I want to reduce the curve on that R because it's a little extreme for me, and the S feels a little bit too fancy. So I'm going to clean that up and make it a little bit more geometric so it kind of feels a little blockier with the rest of the piece. The other thing about this name is there's just a lot of words which happens when you're working with real clients. So I think the best way to combat that is to leverage the different weights within the type family to have some variation so that you really focus on the words that are most important. So I'm going to highlight women's history, and I'm going to do American and museum in a lighter weight so that we can start having some variation. In Paula Scher's logo, she was clearly wrestling with the same problem, but she chose to address it by changing the color of the different words. That works, but I think that this is a good solution for what I'm making. All right, I'm pretty happy with that word mark. We've got a few different options in vertical and horizontal formats so that it can be really responsive, and whatever I come up with for an icon will fit in pretty nicely with what I'm doing. So I know I want to stay away from a W for this, and I want to make some sort of an abstract shape that speaks to storytelling. I keep thinking of this idea of like legacy stacking on itself, or the idea of like opening doors, and I have an arch in mind to start with. I think we could do something about like doorways or pathways opening that could make a lot of sense for the story that is being told with this. Okay, so I'm going to start with a pretty standard graphic arch, maybe something that's kind of cascading. That feels a little sunsetty. Maybe if I do like an interior shape, that looks a little too house-like. Now all I see is an A. Now that's a rainbow. As I keep iterating shapes, I always keep a copy of each time so I have a reference point and kind of a breadcrumb trail of my thought process, but I'm definitely not there yet. Okay, maybe we try it a little bit more geometric and angular. Oh, that's a barn. And now we have the Washington Monument. That's definitely not going to work. I like the way the filled shape starts looking. Maybe we can do something offset so it feels like it's sort of opening. Okay, this is getting somewhere. I like that it's sort of feeling like concentric circles opening up. All right, I'm not mad at that. If this were for a real project, I would start with actual paper sketches. I would do like 50 iterations and keep massaging a lot of different options for that mark and kind of flesh this out to see if there's any other ideas or things I could come up with. But in this case, I think it does the job. I like that it's very simple. It would be easy to embroider or to mark or to blow up or make really small for merch. And even though it's pretty minimal, it has a pretty strong storytelling element to me where it really feels like a doorway opening and kind of cascading forward. So I'm happy with that. Honestly, the logo itself is not going to be the primary focal point of this brand, but I want something that feels bold and friendly and can read well at a lot of different sizes on a lot of different materials. So now I move on to color. There are a lot of different types of color palettes. In this case, I want an extended color palette where each color can stand alone against black. So they're going to be very high contrast, very punchy colors that can look good flat, and they don't really need to interact with each other very much, but they need to feel really strong against black and white. I know I don't want to choose a cobalt or anything in that family, and I want a primary color that can be really recognizable to the brand. This time, this was actually the first decision I made before I made anything else in my heart, because I want to really push myself and use a color that I don't really work with a lot, which is purple. That's not just random. Purple is the color most associated with royalty and then domestic arts and sort of femininity as a whole throughout history in a lot of different spaces. But specifically in the United States, it was the color of the women's suffrage movement and has had a really deep connection to a lot of women's movements in the history of this country. So I love the idea of running with a purple because it really speaks to American women's history. So now the question is, what shade? My methods for picking color are also a little bit extra. I like having a field of all of these circles, and then I start with my inspiration colors and start eye-dropping individual shades that I'm drawn to, and then tweaking them and coming up with a lot of different shades of one color. And I put them all in rows, so then if I know I want a certain color family, I can see a whole bunch of different options within that color, and then I can choose the exact one that I think I want to go with. In this case, I really like this sort of acidic lilac that's almost neon. I think that could be a really strong version of a purple that feels a little bit unexpected, and I think will look really good against black. When I'm making an extended palette, I like picking 2 secondary colors that work well with the first one that will be used most often, and then a range of like 4 to 6 accent colors that can be used either in patterns or in this case for different exhibits. When I know I'm going to be using color in different ratios, I like to actually grid it out so you can see the scale of how much each color works with each other proportional to how much it's going to be used. So this is my end palette laid out in how much I'm actually going to use that color. As it stands, this is a lot, but I want this to feel youthful and vibrant, and so these very like neon bright colors that look good against black is really going to get me a lot of the way there. All right, this is where we're at. We have the primary mark, and then a stable of different logo variations and different orientations and color options so that I have things I can pull from for different backgrounds as I need. The last kind of graphic element that I want to work on are a couple of different patterns that I can use in the future. I'm not really sure how I'm going to start laying out all of this stuff, so I want to have as many ingredients as I can, so I have things I can pull from as I'm laying out posters and stuff. So my first thought is just to take the mark and turn it into a pretty straightforward grid. I think it could make a really cool kind of window pane that could lay on top of images and either overlay on top or have some sort of a screen texture. That could be a pretty cool element. So that's a pretty bold pattern that I can use as like a big element, but I want to make something a little bit more subtle that I can use as more of a texture. I really love this image, how there's sort of a stitch texture on top of a photo. And I love the idea of quilting. I think that there's something about that that really speaks to American women's history. Quilting and sewing and fiber arts is a really large part of that story. And I think that there's something metaphorically about sort of weaving these stories together. Yeah, I like that. This is a pretty minimal element, and I get that it just looks like a grid, but it's important to me that at least I know, even if no one else does, that every element has some sort of a strategic connection and starts to tell a cohesive story and sort of weave those threads. I didn't do that on purpose. So that's the main branding done. The next thing is to create an asset suite for the brand, and that's going to vary vastly depending on the project. In some cases, I may make illustrations or more patterns or textures or whatever. In this case, I know I want it to be really photo-based, and I need to pull together a bunch of photos of women that I want to highlight. Obviously, this is not going to be exhaustive, but I'm going to pull enough images so that I can show a representative sample of what some future exhibits would look like and how they would take this layout and keep moving it forward in the future. So it's going to take me some time. I'm going to go through my own list of some of my favorite women throughout American history and pull some photos that I can use moving forward. So I'll be right back. Okay, that took a hot minute. I gathered photos of 20 women who I really love, and then I took each of those photos, took them into Photoshop, standardized them into black and white, and added a halftone effect so that they all looked fairly similar. Obviously, there's going to be like a pretty wide variation here, but I want to make it as standard as possible so that they all kind of look like they're part of the same series. The next thing I'm going to do is start playing around with laying out some posters for these women that I can use as a series of images. In my head, I'm seeing like a row of posters walking down the street to advertise, or on those big tall banners at the front of a museum to showcase a new exhibit. And I really want to take all of these images and turn them into a series of posters. Poster design is not my strong suit and not something I do a lot of, so it's going to be a lot of trial and error just playing around with different graphic elements and seeing what I can come up with. All right, so as I'm starting to lay these out, I'm definitely in the dip where everything just starts to feel really chaotic. A lot of the inspiration I pulled had this sort of scribbled grungy text over it, and I thought that could be kind of cool, like to do quotes over the images or like to trace the silhouette of someone and do her name, but I just can't make it work in a way that I'm really happy with. So I'm thinking I need to go a little bit blockier. I really like the idea of highlighting their last names because that's how we refer to men throughout history, like founding fathers like Hamilton or Jefferson, but it's not how we tend to address women. I think there's something really powerful about giving this like blocky honor to their last name, like kind of a badge. I also want to make a shape that highlights their field because I want to start grouping them into different categories like women in STEM or in the arts or in politics. So then we can do like different exhibits that highlight women in different fields and spaces. Then if you lay out a museum, you can have like the politics wing, for example. So some sort of system that says that is going to be important. I like the way that the logo icon sort of acts like a stamp on here without needing to put the word mark on these posters. Okay, this is getting somewhere, but it's starting to feel like really colorful. I think I want to narrow down to one accent color per piece and really bring in more solid black. I think it'll be a little bit more striking. So I'm going to bring in a texture for the background that's a little bit grungy. And I love how this grid starts looking like this quilted pattern over this black. It's subtle, but it gives a lot more depth there that I think is kind of cool. All right, I like this layout. It's pretty straightforward, but I think that it could be repeated well, and it would start looking good next to each other in like big giant format. I'm actually going to take these into Canva now, because if I have to make 20 of these, it's actually a lot easier to assemble things in Canva than it is to make a whole bunch of Illustrator pieces. I like to ideate in Illustrator and then bring things over into Canva to sort of mass produce them. Yeah, I like the way this is coming together. I think we're starting to get a good visual language that feels very striking. If it's big blown up on the side of a building as you're walking down the street, it's going to grab your eye. I think we're developing enough elements here that you could see how an internal team could take this and run with it for years and keep coming up with new graphics and merchandise and advertising and exhibits, which is really the goal here. Especially for a really info-heavy brand, you want to give a lot of different ingredients that can be remixed into a lot of different dishes. So I'm going to run away and grab a bunch of mock-ups and see how this lays out. I want to see it in big, giant environmental graphics. I want to make some tickets and badges and other things that you see in a museum, see what it could look like in merch in a museum store. So I'm just going to play around a bit and see what I can come up with these ingredients. But overall, I'm really happy with where this ended up. I think it hits the main objectives of feeling really vibrant and engaging, and it has a wide enough visual language that there's a lot of things that you could keep making with it. And overall, it's the kind of space that I would love to take my nieces to show them American history, which is exactly what I was going for. I'd love to know what you think. Do you like this? Do you hate it? Would you have done something completely different? If you want to try your hand at this brief, it'll be in the description, and I'd love to see what you do with it. If you like this and want to see more, I'll post the first installment I did in this series, so you can see a totally different brand I did. Okay, so without further ado, let me introduce you to my interpretation of the Smithsonian American Women's History Museum.